I'm just going to make just a brief presentation by way of introduction. Since we're all about telling stories this morning, I think that video highlights that really and truly we all have stories, right? And it really comes down to how we shape and share our stories, whether it is cultural, the technological, the historical, whatever it may be. We have to determine with intent how do we shape these stories and by what mechanisms do we share them. So speaking of stories, I'm Rodney Browne, eCaribbean, and I'm just going to share a snippet of my story as it relates to the intersection of Caribbean identity, innovation, and information technology. Sharing the Caribbean experience. This was actually a tagline of I would say it was the second site, but I see Talbot Pike there, my co-worker from way back when. So this was actually the tagline of a site I worked on, my own site, 25 years ago, ancient times by our standards. So back in the dark ages, you can imagine that there was very little Caribbean content to be found online. And one of the common practices that people would engage in back then was sending e-cards, or what we consider to be digital postcards. So you can imagine, I'm on the internet, sent a few e-cards from time to time, happy birthday, whatever the case may be. And the major players were American Greetings and Hallmark. So I'm using these services, and they worked fine enough, well enough, but they always seem to be missing a Caribbean vibe, a Caribbean flavor. So I thought, well, with no idea or experience in creating an e-card service, naturally, I ventured to create an e-card service and called it Caribbean Greetings. So this was again back in 2000 thereabout. We created Caribbean Greetings, and of course, one of the core elements of Caribbean Greetings was content. Because again, the content isn't readily available in a way that is easy to share online. So we had to figure out creative ways in terms of creating content in-house, finding where we could curate the content that was already available online, and partnering with the creative society, writers, graphic designers, photographers, even painters. Persons in St. Kitts Nevis, from St. Kitts Nevis, may know of Rosie Cameron and Kate. We had actually reached out to them because they were quite popular back then, even back then, to loan us a few of their photos of their paintings that we could use as e-cards in this e-card experiment that we were conducting. And so through that, and I could add another element to that, another C, or two other C's, which would be compensation and commerce. Because even at the very beginning, we determined that from a sustainability standpoint and respect for the creators, we didn't want to just, because it was common practice as well, to just take things off the internet and use it as you will. From the very beginning, we determined that any content we were going to use, there had to be some sort of, whether a license arrangement or compensation agreement. And that is always important to consider in terms of respecting creators. So just because I'm trying to be brief with this so we could get Fiona back in and have a brief Q&A. This is just a list of some of the sites that we explored Caribbean content and we experimented with sharing the Caribbean content. Caribbean Greetings, as I mentioned before, we had Caribbean Massive, which was the first Caribbean social media website back in about 2003, 2004, thereabout. Caribbean Buffet, the whole concept behind Caribbean Buffet was to have a site where it was easy for you to find where to eat, what to eat, how to make what you want to eat, or didn't even know. This was, we had the tasting with the corn soup and the saltfish. What is the recipe, how it was made, that kind of thing. So we explored all these different options in terms of sharing Caribbean content. We had eCoconuts, which was actually a virtual token. You could call it somewhat of a partial digital currency that we experimented with The idea was that, and that would have been one of the areas of compensation, where you could earn these digital tokens by interacting with these different sites, and then you could trade in your digital tokens for, it could be a shirt, a mug, or whatever the case may be, and expand on that further on. So what we realized we were doing was essentially we were creating platforms. The Caribbean Greetings, the Caribbean Massive, etc. These were platforms and portals. So platforms allowing creatives and content to be projected, because that's what you do from a platform, you elevate it. Portals allowing people then to connect, whether it is like-minded in terms of Caribbean Massive. I think within 2 years, we got to 10,000 members across the Caribbean. And the first visit I made to Jamaica, like 17, 18 years ago, I was able to connect with persons from Caribbean Massive who I'd never met, obviously, in person prior to that. So platforms, portals, places, these are things that we should always consider. Val mentioned earlier the fact that we don't really have ownership of the distribution. If you're going to invest in infrastructure, then we always have to think about what leverage do we have in the distribution cycle. We're talking about shaping and sharing Caribbean content. Once it gets to the sharing component, what do we have? Well, thankfully we have No Caribbean with Fiona. That's a great start and a great point for us to launch from, but we need many more of that. We need much more of that where people and entities are prepared to support and invest in those. Places, not virtual, non-virtual. So I know I'm speaking from a technological standpoint, but places in this case, I'm thinking physical, actual places and intentional spaces. We had, someone spoke about how do we get the young people in terms of maybe being ambassadors for the culture, etc. We had, I said we, myself and a group and a few other like-minded parties had a community event in December, gift giving and storytelling. So we got a lot of young children out for the gift giving component, but we had it wrapped, no pun intended, in the storytelling. So you had folks who were presenting and telling old stories about the area and the wider community, as well as then having folklore come in. So creating a full experience. So it's not just you're going out, this is in December, you expect to go to a gift session and you get your gift or whatever, and you hear your carol music playing. But we created a full experience where that memory now of the cultural aspect, the memory of the stories being told, a seed may have been planted, who knows, with a few of those children. So places, we should be intentional with creating these spaces that, and any one of us can create a space. I'll make a confession, history was not my favorite subject in school. It was probably, if not the least, close to the least favorite subject for me in school. But as a young adult, getting into business and just traveling and experiencing different things, history and Caribbean history in particular I became very connected with it. And speaking of spaces, I give a plug to, I joined a book club, Bougainvillea Book Club, a year ago. And the reason why I mention Bougainvillea Book Club is I tend to read a lot, but maybe outside of school, the school required reading, maybe I've only read 2 or 3 Caribbean-related books in my adult life. And since being a part of the Bougainvillea Book Club, now a year, I think I've read at least close to 10 books, all of them great books, different authors from around the Caribbean, but presenting and expanding my knowledge of Caribbean culture, Caribbean content. That's an intentional space. So any one of us can venture, if we so desire, whether through technology or otherwise, to create intentional spaces where, whether it is to young people to engage them, through storytelling and other means, because we have to figure out how do we shape it to make it attractive. Again, it wasn't attractive to me in school. Maybe it was how it was presented. We always have to think about that. So, to wrap up, for this year and beyond, some of the areas I'm focusing on, we have Arts Arise. That was one of the programs that we partnered with Bougainvillea and the Dream Center in December for the gift giving, and we're doing a couple other projects, having a poetry competition for children, currently in the fruition. Mango Muse, this is something that I'll probably speak with Premier Brantley about, where mango, as some of you may know, is a big deal in St. Kitts Nevis, particularly in Nevis, but exploring a way in how we shape the mango story, the mango content, and see what we could experiment with the Caribbean Massive, revisiting that, and the Village Voices, speaking, or rather allowing the community a voice, persons in the community, because the mentality is that every village has a voice. We all come from villages. If we don't come directly, our mothers, our fathers, grandparents, etc., those would have been where the voices in terms of the culture, creativity aspects of our communities. So wrapping up there and bringing back in for Fiona so that we can have a brief Q&A. Thank you for the brief. Yeah. All right. Fiona.